Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a Thursday special edition of the Social Housing Roundtable. It's great to have you all with us today. To those who don't know me, my name is Matt Baird. I am the host and founder of the Social Housing Roundtable, which has been running now for nearly 4 years on and off. We had a bit of a break at one point, but certainly strongly for the last 2 years. We come together usually every Tuesday, 11 till 12, though we are doing more Thursday sessions. And the idea is to have true collaborative thought-provoking discussion where anything and everything is welcome to be asked. I think sometimes when you go to conferences, when you go to big events, people are worried about what their voice, about what they might say, but there also isn't always the most time for that wider discussion around a topic. And so that's what we're trying to do here. All sessions are recorded, available on Spotify, Amazon, and YouTube. And this whole enterprise is funded by my recruitment business. So I've been recruiting in housing now for over 11 years. And it's that which keeps this free for everybody. So if you are looking for staff, if you're looking to discuss recruitment, please do get in touch. Today's roundtable is a follow-on from one that we ran in, I believe, 2023. I'm delighted to welcome Jan Taranczuk and Andy Frankum back to the roundtable. To those who listened to the Shatcast podcast I was on yesterday, Dave Loudon actually recalled this session vividly and said it was one of his favourites that he's been to over the last 2 years. So delighted to welcome both Jan and Andy back. I'm going to leave them both to introduce themselves and deep dive today into fire safety, but it is very much an interactive session. So particularly to those who are new, feel free to put questions either in the chat or use the raise hand function as we're going through the presentation. Andy and Jan are very happy to answer as we go along. Alternatively, after about half an hour, it will become a more open forum for discussion anyway, so feel free to ask questions then. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Jan and to Andy to introduce themselves. So Jan, over to you first, judging by my screen.
Okay. Those who know me, Jan Taranczuk, OHP, old housing person, been around longer than I should have been, but involved in fire safety and currently the vice chair of the London and South East branch of the National Social Housing Fire Strategy Group. A catchy title, which I fall over every time I say it. And I'm working very closely with Andy, who is the main man, and I'll shut up and let him start.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that intro, Jan. And thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. My name's Andy Frankum. I'm Exec Director of Health and Safety Compliance for Concept Housing, based in Birmingham, a supported housing provider. But I also chair the National Social Housing Fire Strategy Group, which was a group that was set up following the Lakanal House disaster. And the aim of the group was just to really start to bring providers together and technical expertise really across the fire safety and housing spectrum, because back then the fire safety order had just come in place and so on. So that's me, and I hope you find today useful, but please ask questions or pop stuff in the chat as we go through the presentation, and be about 20-25 minutes, I think, and then we'll so shall I share my screen? I think
Yeah.
Let me just check.
Always the fun bit, make sure it works. Yeah, we're on. Yeah, go to, I guess, presenter mode or whatever it'll be, and it should open it up for you. Wonderful. There you are, Andy.
Can everyone see that? Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so like I say, a bit about the group. We've been around since Lakanal. Currently, we've got 175 member organisations across England and Wales. That's made up of housing associations, councils, and ALMOs. And we represent overall just over 2.9 million homes across England and Wales. Again, we're here to try and influence national policy around fire safety. We've spent lots of time doing various different projects, working collaboratively across the sector, but also with some key partners, including National Fire Chiefs Council, the National Housing Federation, CIH, Fire Protection Association, NLABC, just to name a few. But we've also spent lots of time with representatives at DLUC and the Home Office, and we work quite closely with them too, because we just didn't want it to be just a talking shop. It was very much about how can we influence and try and shape policy across the sector. So I'm going to talk briefly just a bit about our Back to Basics campaign. We obviously, since Grenfell, you know, there's been a significant change in approach across the sector, you know, following that awful disaster. And we felt that whilst government were implementing a series of policies and legislation to try and respond to Grenfell, that we also felt that we needed to really focus in on the fire safety basics, really, because that's what's going to keep people safe. So I'm just going to walk through some of that, and feel free to shout up. Obviously, I mean, I've been in housing 15 years, so I'm a sort of newbie, really, compared to Jan, who's been a lot around a lot longer. But you know, with that combined experience, you know, there's obviously various different parts of legislation that have been acted. The ones on the screen are just a few, but there are others. There are a lot more changes are coming. You know, we've seen the new standards from the regulator in terms of the competence and conduct standard, that again is trying to aim at improving things in the sector. But there's other things like the Renters Reform Bill and, you know, other sort of things. So, you know, the regulatory environment is so challenging at the moment. So for everyone to try and keep abreast of what's going on and what does that mean is quite significant. So lots to think about. Session today was how can we keep residents safe, and I'm sure some of you on the call may have heard about some of these things. You know, might have heard about the golden thread of information, or the safety case regime that the building safety regulator is implementing. We always talk about resident engagement, and you know, I just think sometimes, you know, is that the right terminology? You know, we get hung up on words a little bit, but you know, there's nothing better than walking into a building and having an open conversation with the resident, just to sort of find out what's really going on. There's obviously a focus on high-rise buildings at the moment. You know, following Grenfell, you know, that's where the concern was. But that isn't the true picture, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, just in terms of some analysis that was done by the Home Office. You know, we talked recently, I think there was a recent session on the competence standard. You know, I think it's a good thing that we're starting to think about professionalism and qualifications for senior managers, but fundamentally those changes were brought in because of Grenfell. And what's interesting is that I didn't see any mention of fire safety anywhere in that standard. So I think that's an important point, that you know, whilst we can educate and train managers to a particular standard, you know, it's about how you're making decisions that impact on residents from a fire safety point of view. I guess I've heard some other things as well around, well, we have a compliance team for that, don't we? Don't they do fire safety? Or we hear building safety a lot now, don't we? You know, but what does that mean for the resident? You know, when you talk to a resident, and building safety comes up, well, what does that mean to them? You know, and I think we find there's a lot of challenges around people are trying to educate or engage with residents, and it doesn't mean anything. So it's about how you translate that in terms of that you've got a safe building and how that might impact on those residents. But some people will say we don't have fires, or we don't have many fires. So how are you sure? Do you know how many fires you have? Do you know how many occur across your stock? All these sort of things. And then from a board point of view, is that information flowing up? Are all the performance reporting, is it always green on statutory compliance and fire safety? What's the true picture of that? And so this is just a challenge back really to everyone, just to say, are all of these things in some way, shape, or form going to help to keep residents safe? I think the answer to that is, I don't know that. I don't know what the true answer to that is, but I think what we want to try and do is just highlight about some of the sort of basics that will keep residents safe. James, you got your hand
Yeah,
up?
we've had a point from James, so do come in, James. I think you're still on mute. Just while James is sorting that out, Claire had actually mentioned in the chat there as well that she's sitting nodding as so many of these points apply in her field of data protection too. So yeah, this
hang
is
on.
there we are. James, over to you.
Yeah, hi, good morning there.
Hi, James.
I've done quite a bit on this. I was looking in from the 1st of April for the regs, and the mention of the fact that the guidance also says a staircase of acceptable width must be now included in buildings for everyday use, sufficient for escape purposes. I'm talking about the second staircase that may need to be coming in as well.
Yes.
My question really on this, again, is the assurance and insurance purposes, having somebody recommended, because you'll know yourself, you have to have a responsible person for the buildings who's nominated, and they need to actually register the regulations, don't they, with the fire safety?
Correct. Yeah.
And also on top of that is the fact of the new insurance costs that it's going to cost, where people now, along with remediation and needing to have the area for safety within that as well, isn't there? There's got to be safe areas, and certain lifts have to be remade to fire safety standards. So I'm thinking in terms of housing itself, how much that's going to cost and the safety measures there.
Yeah, I think there's a real challenge around the cost. I think on second staircases, I think there was some recent research done around that, which the outcomes from that demonstrated that there potentially reduced evacuation times by half by doing so. So, I think we generally support that view, where it's adequately, risk assessed as part of, for new build. That's just about making sure you're thinking about that at design stage, whether or not it's in build, because it'd take a bit of time for it to come into building regulation, then over the next couple of years. So, it's just thinking about, the risks you face on a day-to-day basis, and how does that feed into the development process, to try and mitigate that in the future. Because I think a lot of times what tends to happen is development teams tend to, they'll just work to building regulation, when they're doing that. They don't, and that's fine, but building regulation is almost the minimum standard, but as soon as you put people in that building, the risk profile changes significantly. So, that's got to be considered as part of that. And I think on the insurance elements, yeah, you're right. It's a real challenge. I think government are trying to do some work on this. I think they need to do more on it. I know the insurance industry are working on it, but there's a massive problem. There's a problem around competence. So if you need a building engineer, there's very few and far between. who are actually registered, competent, and then the insurance costs are just spiraling through the roof, which is having a massive impact on leaseholders, where remediation is taking place. So you don't have the answers to that, but
Go on, Jan, I can see you were going to dive in on that point too.
Yep. So and Andy, and just to remember, all of that stuff is about new build. It's not about existing. Nobody's going to be altering any lifts in any time soon. It's about new regulations. Existing lift will be existing lifts. You can't suddenly make certain lifts under the new regulations require different lift shafts. So all of those things that you've mentioned, James, are all going to be what comes in the future. And you need to remember, I think we need to remember, that of the 12,500 properties that are currently within the Building Safety Act regime, the majority of them have only got one staircase. And the government made it quite clear that those properties are deemed to be safe anyway. And I think that kind of leads on neatly onto Andy's next slide, which is really about where the fire risk actually is. Over to you, Andy.
An ideal segue. Thank you, Jan. Over to you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And thanks, Jan. So I just wanted to touch on this slide a little bit. This was research that the Home Office did, analysis of fire and severe casualty fires from 2011 through to 2019. And what this tells us is that, well, of course, if we have a significant fire in a high-rise building like we did at Grenfell, because you've got lots of people in the same building, then there's more risk of multiple fatalities occurring. However, in reality, across England and Wales, what's happening is that typically fires will be occurring in domestic dwellings, typically in single houses. That's where fire deaths are occurring. But I just wanted to draw your attention to the purpose-built low-rise, 1 to 3 stories. And we've got, collectively, we've got lots of these buildings. There's a lot more buildings that are 1 to 3 stories than there are of high rises, especially once you get out of London and the big metropolitan areas. But what we're finding is that the rate of fire deaths and severe fire casualties is occurring in lower rise buildings. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I think sometimes when we talk about risk or a risk-based approach to fire safety, we always tend to focus on the higher risk stuff first. And that's right, we should be doing that. But what I'm trying to say here is that there is a high proportion of fires that are occurring in lower rise buildings, and typically you will find that there'll be more older people in those properties as well, retirement schemes for those people that are, dare I say, over 55. Apologies, I don't mean to put an age gap on that, but I think that the research is suggesting that, and Jan's going to sort of touch on that shortly around some of the research that was done around that. But it just highlights that whilst yes, of course, we need to focus on high risk, we also need to keep our eyes in the rear view mirror when it comes to lower rise buildings too, which is why we're running the Back to Basics campaign. All of that's all great, and we can do some of those practical things, but it's really about culture. It's about organisational culture. And I sort of touched on it before around, when we say things like, oh, we've got a compliance team, or we've got a building safety team, or we've got a fire risk assessor that does all that. But the reality is fire safety, just take fire out of it. Let's just talk about safety. It's about everyone playing their part in this. And that means housing officers, maintenance staff, customer service staff. When we're hearing or seeing things that are not right, that need addressing, it's about having a culture where people aren't afraid to raise those points, because I'm sure people don't go work to break the law sometimes, and you know, potentially, you know, what we've seen from the Grenfell inquiry so far is that there was lots of actors, lots of areas where the processes fell down, and people purposely made decisions, not necessarily realizing the impact that those decisions would have. And so it's really important that from an organizational point of view, it's not all, you know, you have to focus on residents in terms of making sure that they're safe, you know, and it's ultimately that the mum test of, you know, if I put my family in this building, would I be happy to do so, you know? And it's also about the workforce as well. It's about raising the competence bar around that, educating people, raising awareness, creating a culture where people can raise issues without the fear of blame, where action can be taken, because that's what's going to keep people safe. But you also need good data and systems, and I'm sure a number of the other sessions that we've seen on the roundtable before have covered off some of those areas. And you know, we've got AWAB's law coming, you know, the focus around repairs and maintenance. All these things add up to having an impact on safety in a block of flats. And so I just wanted to sort of highlight that it's important that we do collaborate and we do communicate. And the amount of time I've spoke to fire professionals who were, you know, they write things down because they have to, because they're bound by the codes of practice and they have to highlight certain things. But at the same time, we need to be knocking on doors and talking to residents and understanding what the real risk is in those blocks, because that's where you'll find out what's going on, and help to make it a safer place for them by doing so. I touched on competence a bit. It's one of my sort of pet themes. I sat on the Health and Safety Executive's interim competence committee before the formal statutory committee came to being. And I was also part of the Working Group 8 Building Safety Manager Competence Work Stream that was put together following the Dame Judith Hackett review. So I do think competence is one of the key areas where we can improve lots of areas around fire safety if we get competence right. And yes, it's a moving feast, but you know, it's just some basic questions here that I just wanted to prompt to say, you know, do you have, you know, I'm sure you have appraisals and things like that at work, but are we considering what those job dependencies are when it comes to fire safety, you know, or safety generally, you know, just interaction with residents, you know, do we cover that? Are we mapping those competencies? How are we making sure that we're maintaining them as things change? Our contractors, are we using competent contractors to do the work that we're doing? Are we managing that and monitoring it? And you know, we talked about remediation earlier. You know, it's great that the social housing sector have taken steps to remediate those buildings when cladding was found, but you know, other works go on in blocks, and fundamentally, that's great. You can employ competent contractors, you can do all of that work, you can do the remediation, but actually, have you got any processes that make sure that that compartmentation isn't breached in the future? Or is the local Sky man going to rock up next week and start putting cables through fire-rated walls, for example? So these are all the things that we, you know, some of the questions that I wanted to probe, but, you know, are they the right questions? Hopefully that's helpful in some way. But lastly, I just think that we're not learning lessons generally. You know, we talk about learning lessons from complaints, complaint handling. It's the same with fire safety, really. Every time we have a fire incident in a property, we need to be able to learn from that incident and understand what worked well, what didn't, and what can we take away from that. But also, I think we need to do that more widely across the sector, because, you know, when we do have a significant fire incident, we should be able to share that information, and, you know, once you know, the time is right to be able to do that, to learn lessons from each other, share that knowledge, so that collectively we can try and help prevent another disaster from happening in the future. But that's just sort of pause for thought, really. But so I'm going to sort of hand over to Jan now, just about, you know, what our view is on what we think will help to keep residents safe. So over to Jan for a bit more. Thank you.
Okay, Andy, thanks. Next slide, if you would, if you're going to press the buttons for me, my friend, that'd be great. For those people who have listened to me before, I apologise straight away. Thank you for coming back. I'm going to say some stuff today that I've said before, and I make no apology about it, because the reality is that with all the stuff about buildings, fire safety begins in your home, and you should be sharing what you know with your residents. It's quite simple. Testing smoke alarms regularly, remembering that your front door, if you're in an apartment, should close properly. Remember that some children under 10 can't hear the noise of a smoke alarm, and families should be aware of that. And remembering that if somebody in the family has got problems with their skin or is immobile and has emollient creams been plastered on them like E45, the reality is that they contain paraffin. And once they've soaked into the bedding or their bedclothes, they basically are sitting there ready to burst into flames if somebody should drop a fag. Next slide, please, Andy. So the whole point about fire safety is about sharing good advice. You should know this already. You should be doing this already at home. But the reality is that anybody walking into any housing member of staff or contractor walking into somebody's property should be aware of smoking issues, cooking issues, electrical equipment, candles, mentioned the door before, not leaving appliances running when you're not in, not overloading sockets. If there's signs of burns on the sockets on the sockets in the wall, then that should be reported to somebody. And the obvious one about not having a barbecue on a balcony, particularly a balcony with the wooden decking. We managed with last year with the London Fire Brigade to get Amazon to take their mobile barbecues off their platform after some shouting and after several fires. Next slide, please, Andy. So look, Andy mentioned Lakanal. It was 11 years ago. And 11 years ago, the judge in March 2013 wrote to Southwark. The link is there. If you haven't read that letter from the coroner to Southwark and you're in housing management, you should be ashamed of yourself, and that should be the first thing you do after I've shut up. Because she said that signage in high-rise residential buildings should be improved. There should be policies around risk assessments. Staff should be properly trained. It should be easy for emergency vehicles to get to the building in the first place. And she said consider retrofitting of sprinklers. And only yesterday, the National Fire Chiefs Council issued a new declaration where they actually used for the first time, the word automatic suppression, because up until now they've only used the word about sprinklers, and sprinklers ain't the only name in the game. And do you have an action plan based on Lakanal, or even based on the initial recommendations from Grenfell? Because if you haven't, how on earth do you know what's going on in your own organisation? Andy, next slide, please.
This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by Alertical. Alertical helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Calls, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alertical works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024.
So 2013, all those years ago, what else do we know? Well, we know that some coroners have had, other coroners have had concerns. We know that the West Sussex coroner, Penny Schofield, who spoke at our event in London in October, was very vociferous about the fact that old people were dying in private rented accommodation because they didn't have any smoke alarms. And as a result of her banging on the drum, that's when the 2015 regulations came in that said private sector properties needed smoke alarms to be installed. And at that point, they said, well, we don't need to do that with the public sector because the public sector knows what they're doing. So here we were last year when the rules were applied to us as well. So there should be a working smoke alarm on every floor with a carbon monoxide detector as well. And the coroner, Stevenage coroner in 2015, because a firefighter had died because the wiring connecting electrical wiring had come off the ceiling and wrapped themselves around the firefighter. The coroner then in 2015 had said, look, you need to only install wiring on ceilings with metal clips. And nobody took any notice. And it wasn't until the Shirley Towers in Southampton was that issued again, and the fire regulations were changed. The fire safety electrical regulations were changed, so everything with wiring should be clipped with metal clips. There shouldn't be any plastic. Then, of course, there's the Stoke coroner. I'll come to that particular comment in a minute. The BRA research we know about as well. I'll come to that as well. And the fact is that I am looking around the room. I'm the oldest one in the room. Fire does discriminate, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then the fact that coroners take time to analyse what's gone on during an inquest and tell people about it under Regulation 28. The point about not learning our lessons. Well, quite often we don't know what's actually happened because nobody actually publicising those reports except us. Andy next. So 2017, fire in a low-rise block. The coroner made it quite clear that a mum and her baby, Zanib and Tofel, had died because they did not stay put. So if anybody ever tells you that stay put is easy and that stay put shouldn't exist and everybody should get out, you need to read that report because it was quite clear that if they had stayed in their properties, they would still be alive. There's all sorts of stuff around stay put. But you need to be aware, non-fire safety people need to be aware that it ain't an easy answer and it depends entirely on the nature of the building. Andy, next slide. So the research, what's it told us? Well, the BRE did some research into fires in Scotland. I don't know why they chose Scotland. And they confirmed what we already know. Most fires start in the kitchen, most deaths occur in the living room. Older people, like me, are more likely to die in a fire, and most deaths do not occur in high-rise flats. That chart that Andy showed earlier on, that very low percentage at the top of that chart, which was the deaths in high-rise, included the 72 people who died in Grenfell in that period of time. And the challenge for us as social housing providers is that if we know that older people are more likely to die in a fire by virtue of an impairment, their mobility, because people die in fires because they can't get away from fires. If we know that us over 65 is going to increase by 3 million over the next 10 years, we have to do something to stop the numbers going up at the same rate as there are more older people knocking about the place, or in my case, stumbling about the place. Andy, next slide, please. And there's the stats, 21-22. Number of deaths, male fatality rate roughly 6 per million, but for women 4, 65 to 79, it's double. In a few years when I'm 80, I'm 4 times more likely to pop my clogs in a fire than you lot. Sobering statistics, which as housing managers, we should be aware of as a matter of course. Andy, next slide. So part of my work with Plumis, the company that produces the water mist system, I analysed all of the coroner's reports that I could find since 2013. The link is there for you if you haven't read it. If you've been with me before in other places, you've heard me read out some of those stories. I won't depress you even more today, but I'll share a couple with you in a minute. But that analysis it is really important because it demonstrates that coroners have identified certain conditions under which people are more likely to die in a fire. Andy. And what we did at Plumis, we looked at all those deaths and we came up with 7 personas. There's a thing about identifying or stereotyping people, but there are certain conditions, certain behaviours that are more likely to be of a fire risk than others. And if you're as a housing manager, whether you're looking after general needs blocks or sheltered blocks, have people living in those properties that fit these personas, you need to be aware that they are more likely to die in a fire if a fire occurs in their property. And it's bleeding obvious. Andy, next slide. Because of that analysis that I did, smoking, 58% of those 43 fires were caused by smoking. And the other analysis is there as well. It's there for you to have a good peruse at in your own time and share with your colleagues. And the more distressing statistic, Andy, next, is there's the age one. So again, I'm just an old geezer more likely to pop my clogs in a fire. And the next one, in the analysis I did, 37% of those people who died were actually in receipt of care. They had carers looking after them. And when the Home Office did their presentation to us in October last year, they had analysed one particular year, 2017, which said that 28% of all of the fires across the country were in receipt, the words were in a care environment. So that means, basically, colleagues, that if roughly 4 people a week are dying in a domestic fire, because it's roughly 200 a year at the moment, if 4 people a week are dying in a fire, one of them is going to be somebody who is being looked after in a care environment. And my argument, my mission, is that if we're looking after people, we should be in a position where we actually stop them dying in a fire, because that particular aspect is unacceptable. And I give you 2 examples. 2 fires recently, which will be in a revised version of that analysis I did before, was a man, I say old, he was younger than me, on a electric bed in his living room in Surrey. 2 carers 4 times a day. Surrey Fire and Rescue Service turn up to do a fire risk assessment on the property and give general advice, and they asked the carers whether they closed the doors at night. And the carers said they didn't close the doors at night, and that the Fire and Rescue Service officers said, well, you should close the doors at night because it's safer. And so the carers that one evening closed the door. He was a smoker, by the way. So they carefully closed the door. And unfortunately, the Fire and Rescue Service staff didn't notice that the smoke alarm for that particular building, that particular flat, was in the hallway. So the old boy dropped his bag, immobile, couldn't move, caught fire. The smoke finally came out under the door and into the hallway. And by the time the smoke alarm went off, the old boy was dead, because the experts didn't look around the property to give advice related specific to the property. Back to what Andy was saying about competence, about it's more box ticking than thinking. And the other one, very briefly, is a housing association in West Sussex, where an old lady of 93 died because the extractor fan in her bathroom caught fire, and she died in the smoke. Extractor fans should be regularly maintained. They should be cleaned. I bet a bottom dollar that if you go to your maintenance teams today and say, what program have we got to maintain our extractor fans? First of all, they won't know where the fans are. And secondly, nobody will be doing anything about it. That's about sharing information. At this point, I pause and take a breath.
Thanks, Ian. So I think just to sort of wrap up session. We're getting towards the end now, but it's just that prompt really about, we talked a lot about risks and how they can present themselves in different ways, but it's all well and good about getting a handle on risk, but are we keeping people safe? And, how can we prevent future deaths from occurring? So, I think what's interesting is that until Grenfell occurred, fire safety or health and safety did not appear in the regulator's sector risk profile very much at all until after Grenfell, which is quite an indictment really of how much focus was placed on safety. But it's important that we're getting assurance on those things, and it's about triangulating your data as well, so that you're getting those from multiple different sources to help you to manage that. And then finally, just a little ask really from both me and Jan. The Electrical Safety First are running a campaign around lithium-ion batteries and e-scooters and e-bikes, and as you all know, this is a bit of an emerging risk, not just in the social housing sector, but more widely. There have been like nearly 190 reported injuries. 13 people have lost their lives as a result. We actually went down to an event in near Parliament, where there was 2 family members of people that had been affected, and it was quite somber being in the room and them telling their story about what had happened. And I think we are fully behind this campaign, that more needs to be done around raising awareness, especially across social housing, because typically it's people in the gig sector, people on low incomes, that will be using this type of equipment. And there was one family, he had left it charging in the hallway downstairs, and he lost his whole family as a result because of the risks around it. But if you bought from reputable firms and using correct chargers and look after the equipment, then those risks are low. But the Electrical Safety First are running the proposed bill, which is we're trying to head into Parliament shortly. But obviously we're coming up to an election as well. So what we're asking is for people to sort of, have the conversation with colleagues. Is this an issue in your organisation, in your blocks? Have a look at the material, get behind the campaign if you can. By all means, speak to local MPs, and petition for that, because the more people that can help to raise awareness of incidents that may have occurred or concerns around this, then the more we can do to try and minimise those lives lost. And I do know the Home Office are doing a lot of work in the background on this to try and mitigate some of this. There's some guidance coming out from the Office of Products and Standards. So there is lots of work going on this, but I think it's important that we just try and highlight the risks around lithium-ion in e-scooters and e-bikes, and be aware of that. So if you get a chance, please have a read of the report and share with colleagues.
Thank you very much, Andy. That's excellent, and thank you, Jan, for all of your input and insight. I want to now open it up to the wider floor. I can see in the chat there that James Hennigan's, but yeah, they've signed off on a new e-scooter and e-bike policy, storage and safety at Taurus. We've done the same at Spring Housing. So alongside my recruitment arm and this, I'm the co-chair of the board for Spring Housing in Birmingham, and we have a lot of people in that kind of gig economy. We do a lot of support for young homeless people, for care leavers, for refugees, and it's a big industry sometimes when it's difficult to access roles. So it's it's scary how quickly these can go up when the right equipment isn't being used, and we had multiple fires and had to act swiftly. So I completely concur. Some of the stats and information you provided today has been, as it always is, I think, harrowing but also vital. I can see Claire's mentioned in the chat there that we need to make sure this conversation continues over and over. Tony had put a point in before I open up to the floor. If anyone would like to come in, please do raise your hand, write me a note, whatever you like. I can bring you in for questions. But there's a point there from Tony, which is, should carers carry a firefighting kit of some form? And I don't know, Jan, whether that's something that you agree with, or that's just adding more pressure onto people who haven't got the training, I guess, is the question.
Well, quite simple, really. The case I gave, it wouldn't have made any difference because the carers had left the building. There shouldn't be a need for carers to have the equipment. Whether there's equipment in the home or not is a matter of personal choice. Some fire services will say, "Oh, we don't recommend fire extinguishers. We shouldn't use them." But in fact, within the advice given by the National Fire Chiefs Council in May 2017, and indeed in the general needs stuff, there is an acknowledgement by the fire services that properly used, a fire extinguisher could be of some use. And I when I was caring for Mrs. T, actually had a condensed aerosol piece of kit at the bottom of my stairs, because I knew that if something did happen, it would be 10 minutes before the fire brigade turned up to do anything with me. And because I'm I'm not a strong geezer, ground floor, I wouldn't be able to get her out of the property anyway. So I think under certain circumstances, fire extinguishers have a role to play, but they have to be dealt with and advised on by people who know what they're talking about.
I'm going to bring in James and then Claire. So James, over to you first. Hopefully.
Hi there. Yeah, Jan, it's only very briefly. I was interested when you said, about the extractor fans.
Yep.
Should that include, other than just assisted living, tenants, should
Yes.
that include all of the extractor fans throughout all the services? Because I'm interested, because I'll get in touch with our...
Well, the answer is yes, and I guarantee you that they're not, because occasionally, because what happens, they get clogged up, and if they get clogged up, they overheat, and if they overheat, they catch fire, and fortunately it doesn't happen very often, but as with everything that happens at night when you're asleep, if it happens in your property under those circumstances, it's not helpful. So the answer is yes, it should happen.
That's great. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Thanks for your time and help and advice.
Problem.
Thank you. Claire, I'm going to bring you in.
Hello, Claire.
Hoping we can hear you.
Well,
Got you. Excellent.
The wrong earpiece in. Thank you again, Jan and Andrew, for that. I think it's something we all know, or we know a lot of it, but we forget it. It just...
You're very quiet, Claire. Could you move the microphone slightly closer to...
How's that? Is that any better?
That's much better. Yeah, thank you.
We just need reminded about this all the time, because it is just so important. So thank you both for that again. I just wanted to highlight the fact that, which I've said in the comments, that this is so similar to data protection in that you're saying, oh, we've got a team that looks after that and I don't need to worry about it. And, it's not my part of my day job, but we're all working towards the same thing, safe homes and safe communities, and data protection is trying to do that as well. We're trying to look after our people. And actually what's interesting, I can see at least 3 of us that I know just from the names that I can see here work in data protection in housing. And we're here to talk about the fire safety because there's such a crossover, because it's about people, and anything to do with people is personal data, therefore data protection kicks in.
Absolutely.
So I just want to encourage more collaboration between your data protection bods and anybody and everybody and everything else in housing. And I need to remind myself of that as well, like with the other teams like fire safety. So again, thank you.
Happy to help.
Thank you, Claire. A point I was going to raise while we're waiting for anyone else who'd like to raise one to come in. Please do utilise local fire services. I've got some friends who started working over the last couple of years, 2 or 3 friends now who've started working for fire services. So much of their role is about community impact. So much of their role is about community involvement. And if you get hold of your local fire service, they will come out and work with you collaboratively, free of charge, continually, and provide lots of advice, guidance, and training. And it ties me in, Jan and Andy, into something. I know this week is Mental Health Awareness Week. And not only that, I think there's a couple of other national campaigns going on, one of which is it's National Hoarding Awareness Week. And hoarding now is more commonplace than OCD and schizophrenia combined in the UK. There's reports that up to 3 or 4% of people could have a hoarding issue. There's a huge concern amongst fire safety with hoarding, as there are with many things. But I think it also comes back to that piece around stigma. And it comes down to that piece. I think sometimes it can be very easy for us as providers and as people who work in the sector to say, well, we've given some advice and guidance. It's up to them whether they follow it. It's not really on us anymore. And that ownership and that we talked before we came on today about a blame culture in housing. It's always someone else's fault. I've done my bit, pass it over kind of thing. Do you think that housing still takes ownership of fire safety and fire risk assessments in the way, and I always compare it, I guess, back to asbestos. We hear asbestos, immediately everything goes to the wall, and we are panicked, we are worried, everyone needs to get out, we need to fix everything immediately. When it comes to damp and mold and when it comes to fire safety, even though we know these are killers, perception-wise, do we think there's still an element of, yeah, but it's on the tenants to sort it out, really, we'll just do our bit? And I don't know what you both think before I bring in Susan. I don't know what you both think around that point.
And
Yeah.
if I go first, because I had a similar conversation with Gavin Smart and I've been talking to him about this for the last 3 years at CIH, because up until recently, his view was that fire safety was a matter for asset managers to sort out, not for housing managers to sort out. I think I've now, by sheer willpower, I've worn him down to the fact that he now accepts that us housing managers have got a enormous job with regard to fire safety, because we're dealing with people, Claire's point, we're dealing with people the whole of the time. And my point in all of this is you don't need to be a fire safety expert. You just have to convert what you're doing at home to the people you're working with and being aware where those risks are most likely to be. So I think if you're involved in the event that's going to take place in Liverpool, Matt, I've been pressing CIH to have a session on fire safety there, because up until now they've shied away from sessions on fire safety because I think it's really, really, really important. We just have to keep saying fire safety is the job of everybody, and housing managers and contractors and gas safety engineers can alert. And the point about hoarding, sorry, back to 2017, there was a death in Derby, and the coroner issued the report that said they considered that housing managers should take hoarding more seriously, because the hoarding was so bad. It was in a house. The hoarding was so bad that it took 2 days for the fire service to recover the body of the resident. And it remains an issue. And yes, we have to keep going because there are, it's important.
And anything to add before I bring in Susan?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think we've moved quite significantly, from the days when the group first established back in, well, originally it was 2009, but we didn't formally establish the group until 2011. And, back then it was issues around fire and rescue services not applying a common sense approach across borders. And, the fire safety order had just come in, and we've moved massive mountains since then. We've got established teams now. There's fire safety, building safety teams embedded in organisations. It's taken, certainly post Grenfell, a more focused approach. It's a board issue, and so I think there's lots of positives, but our message really is that there's still a lot of inconsistency, and for those people that are doing the really good stuff, we need to try and really share what the lessons are from that and how we've achieved that, because that's going to help others in the sector that don't have the resources, don't have the understanding, but they equally want to make sure their residents are safe.
And I think that's so much. We talked about this before. It's an education piece of both ways, not a blame game. And Nigel's just put in the chat there that obviously thank you to you both for raising awareness on LIB fire safety, but also congratulate James on the excellent guidance on the tourist website. There's a worrying lack of awareness of this across the sector. Susan, I'm going to bring you in. Great to have you with us today.
Hello. I don't live in a flat, but I am concerned for tenants that do, especially if they've got like the lithium batteries attached to their mobility scooters and other sort of devices that they have. And they, you know, you're not allowed to keep them in the hallways. You've got to take them inside your flat. And then I'm concerned that if there is a fire inside the flats, you know, the danger. So I actually started researching this, and I'd like to see all housing providers where there's practically possible to put. You can actually buy metal storage units that are solar panelled, so you don't have to have an electric supply to them, but they've got charging capacity. And each of these units have actually got a key and a door, so each tenant can have a key to a compartment within the thing, and they can actually charge their devices up. And I just think so they haven't got to worry that if they leave them outside, they're going to get stolen. But also, I think it takes the risk out of that particular thing being in somebody's flat charging. You go to bed at night and suddenly a fire breaks out, and putting not only that tenant at risk, but tenants in the other flats as well.
Really interesting point. Jan, anything to add on that one?
No, I'll leave Andy to do that, because the first guidance on mobility scooters came out as a result of Andy's work with our group.
Andy.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for the question, Susan. Yeah, I mean, I, with sector colleagues and Fire and Rescue Service, wrote the National Fire Chiefs Council's mobility scooter guidance in residential buildings. It's on the NFCC website. And I know Nigel, who's on the call, also does a bit of work around that. He provides external storage solutions around mobility scooters. But yes, and obviously not all mobility scooters, for example, will enable them to have their battery detached, because some of them are fixed to them. But I take the point that absolutely there are new technologies, new products coming on in the marketplace that can enable that. And whilst the guidance sort of issues a sort of risk-based approach to that, you know, National Fire Safety Guidance does the same. It's an interesting point, you know, but I think as long as the building is being maintained and compartmentation, and then the fire strategy for the building is being delivered properly, then, you know, when we were talking about stay put, for example, you know, all of those things come into play that will enable residents to remain safe, even if you did have a situation where there was a fire, where it buys a certain amount of time, which allows the Fire and Rescue Service to attend to do that. But I appreciate that some people will be more worried about that. It's how we understand what measures we're putting in place and the guidance that we're giving residents, and trying to assure them and make them feel safe that we are taking the right measures. And if someone feels that we're not, then we should be listening to that and taking that seriously, because that ultimately was what happened at Grenfell, and that should never have happened.
And that's exactly what's actually Esther's just put in the chat, which is that it goes back to culture and engagement. And I can see the thanks coming through to you both from today's session. And to anybody who thinks that, you know, as Jan mentioned, he's done this session before and people are listening and yada, yada. I had a quick search before today's session. There was a news article came out this morning from South Gloucestershire Council, who have refused to move the e-bike storage from inside a flat to outside because they say it's fine inside. And it's still ongoing, and that was just this morning. And they said that there are no fire safety concerns. We can have it inside; it will be okay. So there is a huge amount that needs to be done. Thank you to everyone who's been able to join us. I know a few people have had to jump off. Nigel has just shared some work he's done in the Metro Store UK mobility score storage. So go and have a look at that. But Jan, Andrew, thank you both for joining me today. I'm certain this will be followed up on, and we'll discuss this again. But just for now, a huge thanks from me. And to anyone who is new to the roundtable and new to our sessions, next Tuesday we're discussing technology at our normal slot of 11 a.m. So rethinking technology's role in social housing leadership. And then the week after, we've actually got Rick Blakeway, the Ombudsman, coming on to answer questions on the complaint handling code. So lots going on, and we look forward to seeing you all then. But for now, Jan, Andy, thank you both very, very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.